Cam Edwards of Bearing Arms on the latest signs Trump will push for more regulatory gun reforms. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also a CNN contributor and the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and sign up for our free newsletter today if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America from a sober, serious perspective that focuses on hard news and analysis over hot air and opinion. This week, we are going to be discussing some of the new moves from the Trump administration on gun policy. And to do that, we have one of my favorite guests on the show, Cam Edwards, recurring guest who's always here to walk us through some of these changes because he as well covers these things very closely over at Bearing Arms. Welcome back to the show, Cam. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks once again for the invite, Steve. It's good to see you.
Yes, it's good to have you back. It's good to see you again. Can you tell people just a little bit about yourself and Bearing Arms for anybody who hasn't at this point heard of them if they're listening to the show?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, like you, so I do have a colleague at Hot Air, but
yes,
we try to stay away from
I don't mean to insult Hot Air.
We are a little bit more opinionated, I think, than the straight news analysis that you do at the Reload. Yeah, but yes, we too are covering Second Amendment news and information on a daily basis. I also host the Bearing Arms Cam and Company podcast Monday through Thursday, where Steve is also a frequent guest. So yes. A mutual admiration society. And again, I'm always really pleased to get the opportunity to spend some time with you.
Yes, absolutely. And I appreciate your opinions and analysis. There's nothing wrong with doing opinion. It's just not what we do at the Reload. And we try to have other people on to give their opinions and their perspective. And that's why I'm always glad to have you here, because I have a lot of respect for your point of view and your opinions. Speaking of which, let's get into talking about what the Trump administration did this week that signals, that they may, in fact, be serious about making reforms through, at least on the regulatory side of things, through the executive branch on gun policy. First up was they removed the Surgeon General's report on gun violence from the Biden administration from 2024 that was fairly political document, and not the whole thing, but the overarching point of it was that we should have stricter gun control regulations because gun violence is a public health concern. And so we need things like assault weapons bans and universal background checks, right? And so they removed that from the HHS website this week, right?
They did. And it's interesting because, we saw the removal of like the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention website, if not on day one, like day two of the administration. So I was a little surprised that it took some time for this advisory to come down, as you say, given the politicized nature of the previous Surgeon General's announcement. But it apparently has been taken down. Of course, the gun control groups complained about this, saying, life-saving information is no longer available. Well, they apparently have this list of, resources on their website, so folks can go there, I guess. I'm not sure how many people actually access the Surgeon General's website to find access to this information. But, when Vivek Murthy made this pronouncement last year, what's interesting is that violent crime was already declining, according to the Biden administration, right? We were seeing fewer instances of quote unquote gun violence around the country. And yet that was the moment that Vivek Murthy decided, okay, no, this is a public health crisis. So I thought the timing of that was odd. We did see this spike in 2020 in terms of both, violent crime and maybe gun-related suicides as well. But if you look at, what a lot of local agencies are reporting, you look at the FBI crime stats, and I know that there's some dispute about how accurate those are. Certainly, it seems the homicide rates around the country have been going down for the past couple of years.
Yeah, and dramatically so. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So, it tells me a couple of things. A, that the argument that more guns equals more crime is once again been debunked, right? Because we still have far more guns than we did in this country 5 years ago. Yet violent crime, in particular homicides, are going down. But two, it showed me that, again, the Biden administration really was politicizing these issues as part of this whole of government attack on the firearms industry, on the Second Amendment. So whether it was the ATF, whether it was DOJ's positions, or, HHS, try to, bill gun violence and to a certain extent gun ownership and gun availability as a public health crisis. I thought it was an overdue move for the Trump administration to take that down. Obviously, that does not represent the point of view of the Trump administration, and so I think it's entirely appropriate that it's no longer available on the HHS website.
And so I guess one question I have on this, though, I'm interested in your thoughts. Obviously, there was a scandal during the Biden administration where they removed estimates of defensive gun use from the CDC website. Mm-hmm. Do you see a difference between that and this? Right.
I do see a big difference. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because what the Biden administration did was essentially hide the science. Right. These are facts. These are reports that we don't want people to know. I mean, but it didn't mean that CDC took down an entire section about, gun violence, quote unquote. Right. It was that they massaged the data to present a false picture, I think, of defensive gun uses and how often we see these things in the United States. This, I think, is the administration saying we don't agree with this entire document. Right. And so whether you like that position or not, they didn't change what Vivek Murthy said. They didn't take out 2 paragraphs of that report because they didn't like that particular piece, right? They just took this entire report offline. And so I think that there is a substantial difference in between what the Biden administration did with the CDC data and what the Trump administration has done with the former Surgeon General's declaration of gun violence as a public health emergency.
Okay. And presumably the fact that Murphy's document was very much in the form of advocating for new gun restrictions through legislation and fairly political and of its own right. That I guess that's a difference as well, right? As opposed to the defensive gun use stats that were removed under political pressure from activists.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
All right, that makes sense. And then so the other side of this too is the president just has the authority to do this, right? This isn't something where there's a lot of fights over what the president, what Trump has been doing in a lot of other areas, whether he has the authority to do it or not, whether he needs legislation, that fights over, impoundment and funding and so forth. But, stuff like this, pretty straightforward. This is not something that he needs to make a rule through federal rulemaking to accomplish. This is just something he could do on day one. No, he didn't do it on day one. And I will say, like, the HHS put out a statement on this and claimed that it was as a result of Trump's executive order on ordering the gun, review of federal executive branch gun policies. But that explanation is a little bit weird to me because that executive order is for the Department of Justice, not for HHS. But I don't know. What should we make of any of this? The order was to the DOJ and to Attorney General Pam Bondi, but the directive was look at all of the whole of federal government and find out what policies are in conflict with the right to keep and bear arms. So. So that reasoning makes sense to you. Then.
It does. I mean, that doesn't guarantee that Pam Bondi or DOJ attorneys came across this and then told HHS, hey, you know what, this is in conflict with the president's CO, so you got to take it down. Yeah. Obviously, we're not aware of these circumstances there, but but the order was not limited specifically to, look at DOJ, look at ATF, right? It really was. Look at everything in the federal government that could impact our Second Amendment rights. And so I think this would certainly fall under that. Again, I'm not sure that it couldn't have been done earlier, but
I guess that's the other half of it. Like and this can be done. This is one of those situations where I think it's fairly clear that the administration can just do this if they want to. Yeah. There's no real conflict over their authority on this aspect, but there's probably a number of other areas where that's also true and they haven't taken those steps yet. For instance, the zero tolerance policy at the ATF towards, licensed dealers. I don't know. What is this? What do you make of that? Like, should we expect more?
I think we should expect more. And we may be starting to see the focus shift a little bit. I know that on Cam and Company earlier this week, we had sort of talked about how the Second Amendment, has not been a high priority issue for Donald Trump. It wasn't really a high priority issue for him on the campaign trail last year. He didn't talk about it during his joint session of Congress or joint address to Congress. On Thursday, Dan Bongino visited the ATF, tweeted about it. The White House shared that tweet or that post on X and reiterated their support for the right to keep and bear arms. So maybe now we're starting to see, okay, they've taken all of these steps to deal with illegal immigration and, trade, whether you like the actions that have been taken or not. Maybe now there's, a little bit more time to focus on ATF, DOJ, Second Amendment issues. That's the positive spin on this. We'll have to wait and see. It could be just a blip, but I suspect with Kash Patel and Dan Bongino there that you would see fairly quickly and into these practices, right? As you say, the zero tolerance policy was not the result of a formal ATF rule. So it's not like it has to go through a formal repeal process, right?
Yeah, it was just a policy from the White House.
Right. So there could be a directive from Kash Patel today saying, listen, we're going to revert to the old standard. Don't be taking anybody's FFLs away because they made a minor clerical error. Don't interpret these minor clerical errors as a willful violation of the law. Mm-hmm. And I guess perhaps that has happened, but we certainly haven't heard any word of that happening. So,
in fact, the industry was complaining about this, after Trump took office, that they're still enforcing the zero tolerance approach. But it sounds like in your mind, this is not necessarily that they won't do these things. They may not be a top priority, but there's still a likelihood that they'll get around to doing them eventually. And that's what we're seeing with this HHS decision.
I think so. The one, I don't know if it's a concern necessarily, if it's risen to that point yet, but I guess the one note of caution, is that Kash Patel and Dan Bongino are both doing double duty, right? So Kash Patel is the acting director of the ATF, and he's also the current director of the FBI. So how much time and attention is being devoted to the FBI duties as opposed to devoting to the ATF duties, right? And if a lot of that is being delegated or we're putting the ATF stuff on the back burner, that might allow, again, these abusive practices to continue until they're able to pay time and attention specifically to this agency. So that's the one concern that I have, right, is that typically, I don't know about you, but I would think running the FBI is a full-time job. I would think running the ATF is a full-time job.
Supposedly he's also doing this from Las Vegas instead of from, at least that was what one report, I think, from the New York Times indicated. So, and also this is where the sort of lack of experience critique would come into, like Dan Bongino. And I don't think Dan Bongino even has an official position at the ATF at this point. He's just,
I don't think so. He's assistant FBI director.
But, both these guys don't have a wealth of experience running law enforcement agencies. Bongino was a Secret Service agent, and then for a very long time, a media personality after that. And then Patel worked, he was I think he was a lawyer at the DOJ for a while, and then he worked at DOD very briefly at the end of the last term. And then again, he's been kind of a media personality since then. So, do these guys have the experience and expertise to, really push through reforms that they want? Although we'll get into why there's another sign that perhaps that's more positive on that scale later on in the show. But yeah, that'd be the question at hand. Although I guess it kind of moves into our next topic here real quick, which is we did have some actual movement on a rule this week. We had the Attorney General publish a rule on the firearms rights restoration process and how that works. And that's an interesting development as well. That's another sign that perhaps they really are going to do a number of these things. Now, this one seems much more directly to result from the executive order because it's the DOJ doing it. Now they're a bit late on doing this, and it is only one thing that is not necessarily the top priority that people were thinking of. from that executive order. But let's just go through what it does, right? So they put out this rule, and it kind of retakes authority from the ATF to the Attorney General for this process. What do you make of it?
I think you described it as a plan for a plan on Cam and Company earlier this week. And I think it's a good way of putting it, right? So this is sort of a roadmap to what they want to do. But ultimately, for 30 years, there's been this process that exists on paper where people can have their rights restored. You can apply to the ATF, but the problem is that it hasn't been funded for 30 years. And so this exists in theory, but it does not exist in practice. And this is basically Pam Bondi saying we want to bring this back into effect, but we're going to take it away from the ATF. We're going to put it back into the auspices of the Attorney General and under the DOJ. And we're going to develop a plan by which people can apply to have their rights restored. So we don't know what that plan is going to look like. Bondi made it very clear that this was not going to be everybody who got convicted of a felony, everybody who spent, who was convicted of a crime that's eligible for more than a year in jail is automatically going to get their rights restored when their sentence is over. A couple of places in this rule, it talks about preventing violent felons from regaining their right to keep and bear arms. So we don't know what this process is going to look like, but it doesn't appear that it's going to be, entirely automated. Looks like there is going to be some oversight. And I think that this is in line with what we're starting to see from the courts, right? Where you've got, appellate courts like the Third Circuit that have said, at least as an as-applied challenge, the current law is unconstitutional. Like there are going to be some cases where people's Second Amendment rights are being violated because of the current federal statute. Look at a case like Brian Range out of Pennsylvania, who, again, 30 some odd years ago, lied about his income on a food stamp application. This was a misdemeanor, but it was punishable under Pennsylvania law by more than a year in jail. So even though he only got probation, he's been unable to buy a gun for the past 3 decades. And the Third Circuit Court of Appeals, I think even en banc, said Brian Range is not a dangerous person. Brian Range, should have a way to get his gun rights back. And so we've heard, Justice Amy Coney Barrett in the past talk about in the Cantor cases before she was on the Supreme Court, talk about the need for an individualized finding of dangerousness would be a more appropriate avenue than this, just blanket prohibition. And so I think this gets us there, not through court action, but through executive branch action. Right. Yeah. And it could be that one way or the other, we're going to get to this point. Right. And this is just the Trump administration sort of getting ahead of what the Supreme Court might eventually rule and going ahead and providing that route for some individuals to have their Second Amendment rights restored.
Yeah, it's interesting. And it's not necessarily an anti-ATF play either.
No, I don't think so.
It's much more of it seems the reason, at least as they explain it in the rule, and this does appear to check out, basically this authority exists under federal law. You can get your rights restored. The AG has the authority to do that. It's just that the AG delegated this authority to the ATF to come up with a specific process decades ago. They used to do this. And then in the 90s, Congress got upset about it because, the claim was, I believe from Democrats at the time, I think Chuck Schumer was actually the one who sponsored this effort. But they claim that ATF is spending too much time and resources on restoring people's rights. Some of those people, I don't know the data on this, but they claim some of them would reoffend later on, some of the people who had their rights restored. And so they basically made it a priority to completely defund the process, to say ATF can't spend money to do this anymore, and that effectively shut it down. And so the reason they're reclaiming the authority from the ATF is not because they don't think the ATF did a good job with it or what have you, is because the ATF can't do anything with it. And so the only way to reignite this process is to take it away from ATF and figure out some other way to do it. Now they say in the rule they plan to offer up, budget proposals, some language to try and get Congress to restart this process with funding as well. But in the meantime, it sounds like they can go and do some stuff, some of these restorations. And obviously that's created something of a controversy already. There was a pardon attorney at the DOJ who got in a dispute with leadership over this exact question because I think she claims that they were going to start actually start restoring people's rights and make an announcement on this. And she put together a bunch of candidates. They whittled it down to 9 people. We don't know who those people were. And then someone in leadership wanted to add Mel Gibson to the list because he's a prohibited person from a domestic violence misdemeanor conviction he has on his record from 2011. And she wouldn't recommend that. So she was fired over that. This is her claim, right?
Right.
And so it's caused some controversy, but already. And where do you draw that line on who can be restored? Is to people with domestic violence convictions, even if they're less serious ones, I guess, it sort of depends. Yeah. Perhaps on a case by case basis, but. And
I think that's why it goes back to this,
that's where
idea that at least if not an individualized finding of dangerous, that, there may be some excluded categories.
Yeah.
That, okay, if you've been convicted of, crimes X, Y, and Z, we're not going to consider you at all. Maybe there's a time limit on that, right? For certain categories of crimes. So you can't apply for 10 years or 15 years or whatever after your conviction. I mean, there are ways to do that, but
yeah. So the process will be important to understand when they actually put it out.
Yeah. I mean, but you look at Mel Gibson's case. So he pleaded, no contest, I believe it was. So, he did not admit guilt, but he admitted that there was enough evidence to convict him of misdemeanor battery. It has been 14 years. Mel Gibson's not been in trouble with the law since then. He may have made some headlines for comments, but he's not been in trouble with the law.
Right.
And so
I believe his conviction was expunged at the state level as well.
Okay. So, again, I mean, these things are not going to be as cut and dried as, and maybe I think there's one reason why a one size fits all rule policy or one size fits all policy doesn't make a lot of sense here because,
sure,
you can look at somebody like Mel Gibson and maybe Gibson does deserve to have his Second Amendment rights restored, but you could look at somebody else who had a domestic violence misdemeanor conviction in 2011 who did not comply with the terms of his probation. You could also, I'm sure
the thing with domestic violence, especially, right, is that it's going to be very unpopular to rearm somebody who's convicted of domestic violence. And Mel Gibson's case, obviously, I think there's the added twist that he is friends with the president of the United States.
Right. Well, I mean, he probably would not have been on that list if you were not, right?
So that becomes its own sort of controversy as well.
Yeah, I'm actually curious as to who the other 8 names were, because that we don't know, right?
That's what I want to get into actually next is like this process. The process side of it seems really important with this for really for the strategic purposes if you're a gun rights advocate, because while I mentioned earlier that like the bigger ticket items that people are wanting to see rolled back are stuff like the pistol brace ban and the ghost gun ban, stuff like that. And this isn't that, but this has been, as you mentioned, with some of the cases, a priority of the gun rights movement. Now it's been very laser focused on people with nonviolent convictions. So not necessarily Mel Gibson in particular, but Martha Stewart has been kind of a famous example. But Brian Range is probably your really perfect plaintiff for something like this, given his background.
Yeah.
And so you wonder, like, do you think they should take into consideration the fact that he has a chance of getting to the Supreme Court and getting a ruling, which is what a lot of gun rights groups want to see? Or is it just better off to have, like you mentioned earlier, the executive branch just do this process on its own and not worry about these legal fights in the courts?
Listen, from the DOJ's perspective, it shouldn't matter if Brian Range's case is going up to the Supreme Court soon, or the Supreme Court will have a chance to consider his case soon, right? Because I think the DOJ's mission is to ensure that justice is done here, right? And so in the case of Mr. Brian Range, the sooner he could get his rights restored, the sooner justice can be done. From a tactical perspective, obviously, Second Amendment groups say this is a perfect case, right? Or at least a really good case to bring this issue to the justices. So I can see why they would want, hey, Brian, just hang on a little bit longer before you're able to go out and buy a gun. But let's do this avenue instead of that avenue. But I don't think that's DOJ's job to say, hold off, Brian Range. We're going to let the Supreme Court figure this out. And there are going to be other cases, right? So I cannot remember her name, but there's a woman in Utah who was convicted of writing a bad check, basically, maybe a couple of bad checks. This was 20 some odd years ago. She was a drug addict at the time. Felony conviction. She has since turned her life around. She is a counselor now. She's working with the state of Utah to help drug addicts out. I mean, she's at a complete 180-degree turn, right? She would like to be able to regain her gun rights so she could have a firearm in the home to protect her family. She would like to go hunting with her kids. And I don't think it was the Ninth Circuit, but it might have been the Ninth Circuit. Whatever circuit court overviews Utah basically said, no, you are a prohibited person back then, and you will be a prohibited person forevermore, unless, again, there is this process by which you can have your rights restored through ATF or DOJ action. There are going to be plenty of people out there who present compelling cases that they should have their rights restored. Now, their cases may not be as far along as Brian Range's. Hers is pretty close. Yeah. Hers has already been decided at least by a 3-judge panel, so there may be an en banc review, but it could get up to the Supreme Court before long. And I just happen to think, listen, I'm a Second Amendment advocate, but I don't want my 50,000-foot support for the Second Amendment to ever get in the way of the real life men and women whose lives are being impacted by these laws. So the 50,000-foot level is important. So is Brian Range as a human being, as a guy who wants to have his rights restored. And if the fastest way for that to happen is through DOJ policy, that's the quickest way for him to get justice, I'm not going to object if that's what happens.
Sure. I guess the counter argument there, right, is that, a process that the DOJ puts in place to restore these people's rights can just as easily be undone in the next administration, whereas a Supreme Court ruling is harder to undo.
Yeah. Well, again, and if Brian Range was the only person out there, then I think that argument would have more merit, right? But again, he is far from the only prohibited person, far from the only nonviolent offender, who has lost their rights. Right. So there are going to be, I think, a lot of other opportunities for the court to weigh in on this issue without needlessly delaying an individual's restoration. And again, we don't know. We don't know that Brian Range's name was on that list, right? That this could be an entirely
we don't know. We don't know who was on there, and we don't know if they're taking into consideration, strategic litigation, concerns, right? When they're putting now, like you said, they probably shouldn't. That's not really what DOJ should be doing. That's not the role of DOJ.
I wouldn't want, let me put it this way. I would not want, and I'm pretty sure it happened, but I would not want the Biden DOJ taking into consideration, what's Everytown Law doing? Yeah. And are we going to be stepping on their toes if we take this action, right? We would be furious. Sure. If a Democratic administration were doing that. So,
although they do take clearly, like something like Rahimi being one of the cases that being this first Second Amendment case get taken up after Bruin. I think that involved some strategic litigating on the part of the DOJ and that's not necessarily exactly the same thing here, but because that's a DOJ case.
Yeah. But wasn't it Rahimi's? No, it was the DOJ's appeal. That's right. Yeah. It was DOJ's appeal.
No, it was on the glide path to the Supreme Court, but I think the way that they worked it, it got there before, for instance, Range.
Right.
Before that, and then Biden's DOJ did ask them to review Range as well, and a number of other cases, which the court just didn't do. Yeah, which is another perhaps idea here too. It's like maybe who knows when the court might actually act on Range's case? We don't know. But I do want to get the last part here into what to me at least has been the brightest sign that they are the biggest indicator, I guess, that the Trump administration is going to be more serious about using regulatory action this time around, which is that they appointed former Weekly Reload podcast guest and actually somebody who's written for the Reload in the past, George Mason University professor Robert Leider to be ATF Chief Counsel and I believe Assistant Director to the ATF as well. Now, this is somebody who's a Second Amendment scholar, and I would say it's fair to say that he's a gun rights advocate, but also, maybe even more importantly, an expert on the regulatory side of federal gun laws. So what do you, to me, that says, whatever Kash Patel and Dan Bongino might do, or Trump might be focused on lots of other stuff. If somebody like Robert Leider is the chief counsel at the ATF, he doesn't need a lot of, focus from the top to enact or at least propose a bunch of significant regulatory changes.
I think that's absolutely right. Yeah, I think this is a great pick. This is, I don't want to say this is like the legal equivalent of naming Brandon Herrera ATF director, but it kind of is in a way, right? This is somebody who may not be as well known as some other Second Amendment litigators, but is a Second Amendment scholar, is a guy who has, come down on the side of a robust right to keep and bear arms. And somebody, as you say, who has that regulatory background, knows a lot about, the rules and regulations. So if you are wanting to unwind the Biden era rules, but also wanting to put in place new rules that will protect individual gun owners, and, protect the firearms industry from a lot of the vagueness that we've seen from the ATF, right? I mean, that's been one of the problems over the years, is that the ATF comes up with these rules that are so hard to comply with, because you don't really know, right? There's all of these, may language and maybes. And, one of the things that Larry Keene has talked about on my podcast from the National Shooting Sports Foundation is, give us that bright line. So we, it's not that we don't want no lines. We just want to know where the line is. And I think with a guy like Robert Leider there, you are going to see a much more fair treatment of the firearms industry from this agency. It's not going to be as combative as it was during the Biden administration, certainly under Trump. But I think with Leider, you've actually got a chance to put in place rules and regulations that are easy to understand, easy to comply with, and are not designed to trip up gun makers, FFLs, or gun owners.
Yeah, I mean, and hopefully we'll be able to have him back on the show in the near future. That'd be great. But we'll see what the ATF allows him to go out and say publicly. But we do have what he wrote in December when he was arguing basically against the Brandon Herrera argument of shutting down the ATF and in favor of instead having somebody who's an expert go in and use the regulatory process there to, as you suggest, make the ATF enforcement fair, or even just to, there's a lot of ways that you could use ATF rulemaking in efforts that would make gun rights advocates happy, right? And then he suggested a couple of them in the piece. People should go read it directly, but one of the things he suggests is, for instance, the sporting purposes. Sporting purposes in federal law, the ATF has a lot of leeway to determine what sporting purposes is, and this can affect things. This is not a very well-known aspect of federal law outside of gun enthusiasts and especially like people who focus on gun regulations. But it is very broad. Federal law allows the ATF to determine, or the federal government to determine what guns are useful for sporting purposes, and that can affect things like importation of firearms. What firearms you can. There's just a wealth of different aspects. It's kind of hard to explain very briefly here, but it's something that he talked about in that piece. Coming up with maybe a more updated version of what is sporting purposes, like is competition shooting, does that sporting purpose? If so, then a lot of AR-15 style firearms could be imported under that if that ATF decide to go that route. There's just a lot of ways beyond just rolling back some of what Biden had done that you could get at new reforms without needing legislation, which is particularly important, right? Because we're unlikely to get new legislation through this Congress.
I mean, honestly, legislatively, I think Congress needs to go back and actually remove that sporting purposes language. The Supreme Court has said that the primary, reason for the Second Amendment is self-defense. So if you are limiting arms that have a sporting purpose, quote unquote, to me, that flies in the face of Supreme Court precedent. But you're right. We're not likely to see Congress be able to enact those changes, right? As long as cloture exists in the Senate. And so, what Leider's basically suggesting is, just as the Biden administration used the ATF to pass these regulations and bypass Congress, you can do the same thing from a pro-Second Amendment perspective.
Or tried to, at least, right? Biden got tied up a lot in court with his attempts. But.
He did. But I would argue that it's probably easier to use the regulatory power to protect the right to keep and bear arms than it is
the
to
other direction,
attack the right to keep and bear arms, right? Simply because we have that constitutional protection. Yeah. I think you're going to, now again, we'll see what lawsuits get filed and where they get filed. And, they may find a friendly judge that's going to, strike down any rule that would be a good for the industry or for gun owners. But I do think that because this is an enumerated right we're talking about, the thumb should be on the scale in terms of, siding with the Second Amendment when it comes to any court challenges.
And we also have to see what Leider can deliver. Now, Leider can write up a ton of different rules and uses, expertise on federal law to come up with all kinds of reforms. There's still going to need to be the political will to enact those from the administration, which is something you still have to keep on top of all this. It's not like just because they picked somebody like Leider to be in this position that you're guaranteed to get, Second Amendment advocates are guaranteed to get everything they want. It's just, it's a good sign of that, right?
Yeah, I think so. Again, we'll see where this goes. I think, the next few months are really going to be telling, but I am also, I'm cautiously optimistic because Leider's position was not one of benign neglect. It wasn't one of just, let's just, stop what had happened and then we'll just, keep the status quo in place, right? He did talk about a path forward to not only rolling back some of these regulations that were promulgated under Biden, but going off in a new direction. And so, we'll see what kind of resistance he meets with, both internally within the agency and, externally as well. But I think that these are, everything we talked about today are good steps. They're not the end of the journey. And in fact, I would say that, these are first steps. We need to see a lot more, but I think we're starting to see movement in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, if without the Leider appointment, to me, there hasn't been much done yet, right? Even with the Leider the appointment itself isn't doing anything, right? But it suggests they're going to do more because, this deadline for the review has passed twice now. And the only thing that they've actually announced is that the rights restoration process, a plan for a plan, basically. So I think without the Leider appointment, people who are following this closely would maybe be a little bit more peeved at the situation at the moment. But, his appointment gives you reason to think, well, it's probably not the end of it.
I don't think this is the end of it. No. Yeah. Again, we are just a few months into this administration.
Yes, that's true too.
So while this has not been the day one issue that I think gun owners had hoped it would be, and I know Trump even said at one point that he would roll back these regulations on day one. Obviously, that hasn't happened.
Right.
There's been a certain amount of chaos over the past couple of months as the administration has, tried to move forward and move forward very quickly on some issues, and they've had to go back. So,
which adds to the contrast here, right? This idea that it's not a top priority because they're not doing those kind of like very aggressive moves, whatever you think of them. They're not doing that with the gun stuff. But again, I think to your point earlier, it doesn't mean they won't do them.
It doesn't. And they seem to be putting, again, with Leider's appointment, putting people in place that could actually do a methodical, rollback that doesn't get overturned in court, that doesn't get halted, right? That is not, taking too big a bite out of the apple at one time. So frankly, I would much rather see that, something that takes these steps that are maybe more moderate steps than something that, goes way big. And then all of a sudden, all right, well, now you're not going to get any of it. Right.
Right. Yeah. That's a good point too. Yeah. And that is the difference in approach. Like you point somebody like Leider over, a talking head type, or like somebody who's splashier but doesn't have the expertise level. That is a very good point, I think. And so there's another reason perhaps to think to see this as a sign gun rights advocates ought to read as positive. But hey, look, I appreciate you coming on the show. It's good to have you back on. Been a little while, so always happy to have you here to give your insight. If people want to follow you or even watch our most recent episode from the farm, as you are live from the farm now, where can they do that?
Yeah, I knew the rooster would make an appearance at some point this hour.
With the third guest on the show.
There he goes again. All right. Yeah, just bearingarms.com. You can find my writing. You can find the podcast there as well, but also just go to YouTube, Rumble, whatever, and look up Bearing Arms Cam and Company. As always, Stephen, it is great to spend time with you. I'm looking forward to catching up with you in person here in a month. And have you excuse me, I need to go murder a rooster.
I might have to get some of those eggs that you got. The prices.
You know what? I'll bring you a dozen to Atlanta.
Nice,
right.
Like a bribe there. Yeah, Atlanta, the NRA annual meeting will both be there. So look forward to seeing that and reporting on it. But that's all we've got for you guys this week. I'm going to tell you a little bit about another good publication that I like, the Dispatch here. All right, folks, it's time to talk a little bit about the Dispatch, doing an ad swap here between the Reload and the Dispatch. And I think that's fitting because if you like what you're getting from the Reload in terms of high quality reporting that focuses on hard news, you'll probably like the Dispatch as well, because get this, they also focus on high quality reporting and hard news. Now, they are a much broader publication than the Reload. We obviously focus on one specific area, whereas the Dispatch has a much larger team and is able to focus on a whole number of other issues, but still primarily in that national politics realm like we do here at the Reload. But they are one of my favorite publications. I am a paying member to the Dispatch. And so clearly, I highly recommend it. I've been a paying member since they were founded, and I've never had reason to rethink that even once. So they are constantly breaking news stories. They are sending you newsletters on whatever frequency you want. They have quite a variety of them over there. But I subscribe, for instance, to the Morning Dispatch, and I get, I think, a very nice summary of what's really going on from a pretty sober perspective. That newsletter is hard news, and it's focused on it. And I think it's fantastic. But they also, of course, have some of the best commentators, in my personal opinion, over there as well. It was an outlet founded by Steve Hayes and Jonah Goldberg, two guys I've known for a long time. They've been on the Reloads podcast. Kevin Williamson as well has been on our podcast. So you've heard from these guys if you've been a Reload listener for a while here. And, I think you should check out the Dispatch if you haven't already. We have a free trial as well, 30-day free trial for Reload listeners if you want to go over and check out their paid offering, which I think is well worth the money. So I'd encourage you to do that. There's a link in the description of this podcast or on our website if you want to check it out. So head over to the Reload to get that link, or head over to the Dispatch to see what they're all about.